Well, I'm really excited about today's episode because we're discussing a really important topic and one that I know Ross is quite passionate about. We're going to be talking about type 2 diabetes. We're going to go to a whole lot of detail and also touch on something I know that Dr. Ross refers to a lot called diabesity. I love this word that you've created, or at least that you reference, Ross, which is essentially the combination of type 2 diabetes and obesity and the rise of this in our society. Welcome to the Eat, Live and Move podcast by Miyagi, a space where we bring you the latest science-backed conversations, expert insights and practical tips relating to all things health and wellness. I'm Dr. Gina Cleo, your personal habit change expert.
And I'm Dr. Ross Walker, a cardiologist and preventative health expert.
And together with 60 plus years of collective experience, we're on a mission to help you improve your health and transform your habits so that you can eat, live and move better, one episode at a time without the fluff or the fads. Ross, it is so great to be here with you. I think it's been a little over a month since we've recorded a podcast together because I've been traveling overseas. How have you been?
Well, I can't boast to having an overseas trip, but I can say that I've just come out of a respiratory illness. So for all the people listening, there's quite a few respiratory infections going around in Australia at the moment for the people living in Australia. And I've had a thing called the human metapneumovirus, which is probably now much worse than COVID, because COVID initially was a very serious infection that killed a lot of people tragically, and a lot of people ended up in intensive care. But now it's devolved down to become just a little bit more than the common cold. So things like RSV, influenza, and this human metapneumovirus knock you around for a couple of weeks. So I've just come out of that. And then as I've improved, I had the flu vaccine on Monday. So if the voice is still a little bit croaky and I have to stop for a throat lozenge, you understand why. But other than that, life's terrific. Very good.
Oh gosh, Ross, that sounds like a battleground.
No, that's all right.
Are your symptoms similar to COVID?
Oh yeah, it's all respiratory tract infections have very similar symptoms, which are sore throat, cough, which may or may not be productive, feel lousy, and a few aches and pains, and it can last for a week or two. Mine lasts for 2 or 3 weeks, and I still have a bit of a cough, but it's no big deal. Let's get on with a much more interesting topic.
You're good. Okay. Well, I'm really excited about today's episode because we're discussing a really important topic and one that I know Ross is quite passionate about. We're going to be talking about type 2 diabetes. We're going to go to a whole lot of detail and also touch on something I know that Dr. Ross refers to a lot called diabesity. I love this word that you've created, or at least that you reference, Ross, which is essentially the combination of type 2 diabetes and obesity and the rise of this in our society as what Ross refers to as the new epidemic. And it certainly is. And I was looking at some data and research and seeing the rapid increase of the incidences of diabetes. Because there is so much to cover on this topic, and it's certainly something that I know Dr. Ross is so passionate about, we're going to cover the content in a 2-part series. So today, this is the first part of it, and we're going to cover firstly, well, what is type 2 diabetes? What's the key difference between type 2 and type 1, because they sound the same, but they're actually very different types of diabetes. Then we're going to look at some stats. I love data, so give me all the numbers. I want to know about like how many people are actually impacted by diabetes in Australia, but also all around the world. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the symptoms to look out for. And if you think that you might have type 2 diabetes and the diagnosis. And then we're going to discuss diabesity, the dangerous combination of obesity and diabetes. And we're not finishing there. We are finishing off with one more thing. We're going to dive into the key risk factors, looking at what contributes to this disease and increases your risk. So this could be a game changer episode. We're so glad that you're here. And then next week, we're going to then dive into the management of this condition. We're going to take a closer look at some medications and the different types of meds, from tablets to injecting insulin. We're going to talk about the importance of lifestyle management and what you can actually do to lower your medications or even put type 2 diabetes into remission. remission, which is possible. I have worked with patients myself and have helped them to reverse type 2 diabetes. And most importantly, if you're pre-diabetic now, then how can you actually prevent getting type 2 diabetes altogether? That is going to be a really powerful topic. So much to cover, hence why we're doing it in 2 parts. So Ross, are you ready to jump right in?
Absolutely.
Amazing. And remember, if you have not subscribed yet to our podcast, we would love it so much if you hit that subscribe button so that you can listen to our pods whenever we drop a new episode. All right, Ross and let's came together. I was like, let's, and I thought Ross, and I said loss.
I've been called
but you
a lot
responded
worse things
anyway.
than loss, I can tell you.
Okay, well, Ross, let's start by defining what diabetes is. I always like to start with, a definition so that everyone can be on the same page. And I'd really like if you could also help us to distinguish between the different types of diabetes.
Okay,
So
well, let's start with the less common one, which is type 1 diabetes. It used to be called insulin-dependent diabetes, and I'll explain to you why that's a good term, but it should be mistaken for something else I'll get onto. But firstly, type 1 diabetes is felt to be an autoimmune condition. Now, I say all the time, your genes loads the gun, the environment pulls the trigger. This is a very, very good example with this, because with this condition, you have the genetic predisposition to type 1 diabetes, and then something comes along like a toxin. It might be a specific virus, it could be some sort of chemical that attacks the pancreas and completely wipes it out, destroying what we call the beta cells in the pancreas, which make insulin. And we're not really sure why this happens, but we do know that the genetically predisposed people often have this. And it typically occurs in children between about the ages of 2 up to about 12, but still 25% of type 1 diabetes can occur in older children or in young adults, and sometimes very rarely in much older people. So typically it's the young person comes along, gets a virus, and bang, it wipes out their pancreas, and immediately they have to go into insulin therapy in some form for the rest of their life. It's not curable at this stage, but there's a huge amount of research going into trying to do something to pick up people at risk for type 1 diabetes, maybe give them treatments before it happens or right at the start so they can salvage what's left of the beta cells in the pancreas. So that's type 1 diabetes. Now, again, insulin dependent right from the start. But here's where a lot of people get this wrong. A lot of type 2 diabetics, which we'll get onto in a second, after a while have to go onto insulin. They say, I've gone from being a type 2 to a type 1. No, they haven't. They've become insulin requiring, not insulin dependent. Completely different issue. So the type 1 diabetics are there. And interestingly, I find with type 1 diabetes, the standard ones I call type 1A diabetics, but there are the type 1B diabetics that not only have diabetes, but they have a whole lot of other endocrine associations with it as well, where they can actually get an underactive thyroid or something wrong with their pituitary or their adrenal gland. And so they tend to be a bit different to the type 1s. And the interesting thing about type 1 diabetics, they're at higher risk for a whole lot of vascular problems as they get older. But some diabetics I have as patients who've been diabetics for 30, 40 years don't have any vascular disease at all. So there's a whole lot we don't understand. Even though I said there's no way to cure type 1 diabetes, it can be very well managed these days, and we're getting better and better at management, which we'll talk about obviously in the next podcast. But it's absolutely nothing to do with lifestyle to cause it, but lifestyle is very important to treat it.
I was actually going to ask this. I was going to ask you, you said that it wasn't curable.
Yeah.
But then, so what you've just said then, it also means that it's not preventable.
No, it's not. There's nothing at all that you can do in your life to stop you getting type 1 diabetes if you're going to get it and you're exposed to the toxin that brings it out. There's nothing you can do about
that. Well, that really sucks.
Well, of course it sucks. But as I said, we're getting, I've got some really exciting things to talk about in the next podcast in terms of managing type 1 diabetes.
Okay.
But I'm not going to give that away right now.
I like that.
Yeah.
All right. And out of all the people that have diabetes, how many, what's the proportion that would be type 1?
Somewhere between 5 to 10%. You see, it's not that there's just type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. There's a whole lot of other things that may precipitate diabetes. So, for example, if you've got pancreatic disease for another reason, just say you have an acute episode of pancreatitis and your pancreas fails, then you'll become a diabetic. So that's not classically what we're talking about here. Or some
Yeah.
people who have severe liver disease, they have what we call hepatogenous or liver-induced diabetes as well. It's got nothing to do with type 2 diabetes or type 1. So it's not about 90% standard classical type 2 diabetes, which we'll get to very soon, and 5 to 10% standard classical type 1 or type 1A or type 1B diabetes.
Okay, so that's type 1. Why don't you let us know a little bit more about type 2 then, and what the difference between the two are?
Okay. Well, they're vastly different diseases. Type 2 diabetes is almost always, not always, because there are some other genetic abnormalities, but almost always due to the commonest genetic abnormality in the world, and that is insulin resistant. So 30% of Caucasians are insulin resistant, 50% of Asians are insulin resistant, and close to 100% of people with darker or olive skin, and I'm talking to one at the moment, has the gene for insulin resistance. And so when you then expose a person with that gene for insulin resistance to modern rubbish, modern lifestyle, then out comes the insulin resistant gene and all the manifestations of that, which we'll get onto in a second. So that is the vast majority of diabetes, is this type 2 diabetes that comes from insulin resistance. And the problem is it is a survival advantage to be insulin resistant if you're a hunter-gatherer. But it's a survival disadvantage to be insulin resistant if you live in this society. Because as a hunter-gatherer, we were designed to wake up in the morning, pick up the spear, wander around the jungle to find food. If the food wasn't there, you went hungry. But in our society, breakfast, lunch, dinner, sit in our bums all day. And what happens is the insulin resistance just becomes absolutely manifest.
My gosh, that's fascinating. You know what's so interesting about this is obviously, okay, so I'm Egyptian. My whole family is Egyptian, my dad, mom. And my dad, I can't believe he does not have diabetes or anywhere near diabetes, because he has like 7 spoons of sugar in his tea and coffee. Like, the man is out of control. He has dessert every single day. And every time he gets a blood test, he has high cholesterol, he has high blood pressure, he has all this other stuff, but his blood sugar levels, perfect.
So that's just a brilliant point, because we're talking about insulin resistance. Your dad's insulin resistant, but his predisposition to diabetes is obviously not particularly high, but he's predisposed to blood pressure, cholesterol issues. I don't know your dad, but possibly fat around the belly, all of the things that are manifestations of insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is the gene, but when you have 2 or more of the characteristics of insulin resistance, then it becomes what we call metabolic syndrome. So let me explain those, because I think that's really important. So insulin resistance leads to, number 1, pre-diabetes, diabetes, because what happens is that when you're insulin sensitive, the receptors on the cells open up and accept the nutrients like glucose and fat to get into the cell. When you're insulin resistant, the door's jammed. So the only way to force that door open all your life is you make higher levels of insulin. And so after a while, your pancreas says, I just can't keep doing this, starts to fail. As it fails, up goes your sugar levels. And so therefore pre-diabetes, diabetes. So that's number 1. But also with the insulin resistance gene, you're predisposed to hypertension. So your blood pressure starts to go up above 120/80. And we've spoken about hypertension on a prior podcast, so I won't go back on that. Number 3 is what we call dyslipidemia. Now, dyslipidemia is not just a high cholesterol, it's more a high triglyceride and low HDL. So HDL is so-called good cholesterol. It's not, but it just works for this discussion. So high triglyceride, low HDL is another manifestation of insulin resistance. We call that dyslipidemia. Then it's abdominal obesity, which is characterized in a male as having a waist circumference over 95 centimeters, for a female over 80 centimeters. Sorry, ladies, I don't make the rules. And so all of those things are manifestations of insulin resistance. So if you've got 2 or more of those, then you have what we call metabolic syndrome, and metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, all leads to all forms of cardiovascular disease, obesity-related cancers, fatty liver, gout, and in women, polycystic ovaries. So all of these things occur because of insulin resistance, and thus we're talking today about one of the major manifestations, which is type 2 diabetes.
That makes so much more sense. I've always thought that insulin resistance will only impact your risk of diabetes.
No.
But now understanding that it's the metabolic syndrome. Okay, now I get it.
Yeah, and can I say,
fascinating.
Insulin resistance is the cause of 70% of heart disease. 70.
Oh,
so
my
it's
gosh.
the commonest cause of cardiovascular disease.
So brown-skinned, we're screwed.
No,
We're done for.
No, because there's so much you can do to stop that. And there are some people who are insulin resistant where it never affects them at all. So it just depends. It's so important. This is the key to all of this discussion. It is so important to manage your lifestyle. That's because, as I talk about all the time, the 80-10-10 rule, 80% of anyone's management is how they look after themselves. 10% the appropriate use of pharmaceuticals if you need them. 10% the appropriate use of evidence-based supplements.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Ross, once someone is diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, I'm assuming, you said that the pancreas gets to a stage where it's like, I'm done.
Yep.
How long before that happens can you kind of see signs, or, it's obviously like if this happens over a long term, like years, I'm assuming. Yep. So talk to us about that. Like, at what stage are the cells like, peace out, I'm done?
Typically you've got to lose somewhere between 50 to 70% of the insulin producing cells before you become diabetic. And this is the thing about any disease. The guy who designed the body was very clever. And basically there's a huge amount of reserve in the body. So, for example, if you're a smoker, why would anyone do that to themselves? But if you are, you've still got to damage about 70 to 75% of your lungs before you get short of breath. With the heart, we have a thing called ejection fraction, which is how well the heart's pumping. You've got to damage a lot of the heart before you start to get symptoms. So there is incredible reserve in the body in all organs, including the pancreas.
Okay. So it's really something that it's a lifestyle you've been living for a long period of time that's impacted,
of course,
the likelihood that you've developed diabetes, which is why it's the 80% is the lifestyle part.
Yeah, that is exactly right. And all the studies show that lifestyle factors, if you can live a very healthy lifestyle, that is 4 times more powerful than any damn drug or supplement a doctor can give you. And I think that's the key message I'd like anyone to take away from this discussion, that you are in charge of your health. And what you do to your health is so much more powerful than anything a doctor can suggest. And I have so many people come in with the big waist circumference that they shouldn't have, but they say, but doctor, I'm taking that Lipitor, that's going to help me. No, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I love hearing that. It's really empowering to know we are in control. Like, yes, we have genetics. Yes, we have insulin resistance, but we have so much control over the outcomes of our health. I want to know more about the lifestyle stuff, but before we do, I would really love to touch on gestational diabetes. I know it's not as common as type 1 and type 2, but can you please explain, firstly, what is gestational diabetes? And if a woman does have like gestational diabetes, does that make them more at risk of developing diabetes in the future? My bestie actually had gestational with her first baby. She's pregnant again now, but doesn't have gestational at this stage.
But she almost certainly will get it, unless she can keep the weight right down. But you do need to put on a bit of weight during pregnancy.
Listening.
Yeah, listen,
she's
Monica.
Tiny. She's a tiny little Asian.
Yeah. Well, she's 50% chance of being insulin resistant. So almost all women who get gestational diabetes are insulin resistant. I mean, that's the reason they're getting it. And see, here's the point about anything in life. When you stress the body and you have an underlying predisposition like insulin resistance, that stress brings out the insulin resistance and thus gestational diabetes. So tends to occur in the latter part of pregnancy, about the 24th to the 28th week. So that's the time when it tends to occur. But it doesn't have to occur within that time frame. It can occur later. It can occur a bit earlier. And the other big thing here is for women not to gain too much weight during the pregnancy, because that will also bring it out. But it's the insulin resistance on the background that brings out the gestational diabetes.
Right. Okay. Yes. So that's not necessarily lifestyle.
Oh, well, it is partially
both.
lifestyle, but it's also the fact that it's the stresses of the pregnancy. And the point is, if a woman has gestational diabetes, as I said, they're insulin resistant. So as they get older, especially if they put on weight, out comes the type 2 diabetes. So there's a very strong link between that.
Yes. Okay. And so what about if a woman has had gestational, doesn't necessarily have like insulin resistance in general, like may not have that gene? Are they at higher risk of developing diabetes, type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, well, there could be, because as I said, the type 2 diabetes is mainly due to insulin resistance, but there are other genetic abnormalities that can also lead to diabetes that aren't really specifically focused around insulin resistance. So the point about anything in life, there's never one explanation for everything. So yes, though, if someone has gestational diabetes, even if they're not insulin resistant, which is unlikely, but even if they're not, they still have a higher risk of getting diabetes as they get older. It's a bit like if you have blood pressure during pregnancy, your chance of getting blood pressure as you get older is close to 100%.
Okay. I feel like children are just like an amplifier. They're just like, here I am, and I'm just going to amplify all the things that you would have had without me, but here I am, and I'm giving you all the stuff.
Yeah, and also I think something that I think would be a great idea for a future podcast is talk about health being preconception to the grave. And there's a lot of really interesting things around that, but I'll leave that one for another time.
Okay, sounds good. So okay, I'm hearing you now. So if you're a woman, you've had gestational diabetes, I think the point here is to be extra vigilant with your lifestyle so that you can prevent the likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes later on in life.
Because
is that fair to say?
Yeah, an across-the-board study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is, in my view, the greatest journal in the world, the greatest medical journal in the world, found that 70% of women with a history of gestational diabetes will eventually get type 2 diabetes as they get older. And typically, those are the ones that are gaining weight as they get older.
70%, that's huge.
It is.
Okay, that is so valuable to know. I feel like we don't hear this stuff enough, but this is really good. I'm so glad you're sharing this with us.
So if people are listening to this and they're in their 30s and 40s, they might have had one or two kids and maybe gestational diabetes, please, the great message here is how you look after yourself for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It will really impact on your health later on. See it like paying insurance. You might need it now, but you certainly may need it later on.
Yeah, love that. All right, so now we've learned a little bit about all the different types of diabetes. I want to focus mostly on type 2 diabetes because that's the most common one by far. And one of my favorite words is statistics and data. Well, actually, I don't like doing statistics. I just like learning about the stats. And did you know that 1 in 20, or about 5.3% of people in Australia had diabetes 2 years ago, so in 2022? That's a huge number. It's 1.3 million people.
But the figures are also showing
Australia.
that about 8% of Australian adults will develop type 2 diabetes at some stage because of what I said about the 30% Caucasians with insulin resistance, 50% Asians, and close to 100% of people with darker or olive skin.
Well, that's also interesting because there are lots of people with undiagnosed type 2 diabetes. So it's estimated that an extra sort of 500,000 people, and this is according to Diabetes Australia, actually have diabetes and they don't know about it.
That's it. And that's
and
you see,
huge.
It's a bit like blood pressure. You don't know you're diabetic unless you have the test. And it's the same thing. You don't know your blood pressure's high unless you check your blood pressure. So that's straightforward. So that's why it's so important people know what their fasting sugar levels are, what their fasting hemoglobin A1C, which is 3-month sugar control. I'm not a great believer in that glucose tolerance test, which I think is 2 hours of your life you'll never get back. When you go into a pathology department and you go in fasted, they check your blood sugar level, give you this horrible sugar drink. Yeah, horrible sugar drink, 70 grams of sugar. It's just dreadful. And they measure your sugar over the next couple of hours. You don't need to know about that. You just need to know what is your fasting sugar, your fasting hemoglobin A1C. And the definitions I use are a fasting sugar between 6 to 7.5 millimoles per litre is pre-diabetes. A fasting hemoglobin A1C between 5.5 to 6.5 is pre-diabetes. And above those two levels, above 7.5 blood sugar level, above 6.5% hemoglobin A1C is frank diabetes.
Okay, frank diabetes.
Yeah, he's
like
a guy
you
who just
definitely
lives
got
down
it.
the road. Frank, yeah.
Like frank.
Yeah, no, Frank.
Okay, amazing. Now, I was having a look the other day and I was looking at the diseases that are fastest growing. And no surprise, is that type 2 diabetes is one of the fastest growing illnesses that we have in our modern society. And we have seen the stats in Australia that it is steadily increasing over the years, largely driven by factors like the aging population, rising obesity rates, and being sedentary, just not moving our butts.
Yep. No doubt whatsoever. And see that it's ranked about seventh, but I think that's probably being a bit gentle on diabetes, because we're not talking about people who are insulin resistant, who they may not be frank diabetics, they could be pre-diabetic or even non-diabetic. But as you said about your dad, high blood pressure, cholesterol issues, fat around the belly, all of those things
Gout.
can lead to gout.
Yep.
That's all part of the insulin resistant syndrome. So all of those things can also lead to death as well, even if you're not a frank diabetic.
I feel like some of these things need a name change. Like type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes are so different from each other. And when we say this person has diabetes, we think of it as a lifestyle thing mostly.
Yep.
But type 1 is not like that. And then insulin resistance sounds like it's a diabetes disease, but it's not. It's got all this other stuff.
It has. And that's the
I need
point.
to speak to the person who labeled all these things.
But that's why they now call it metabolic syndrome, because you can have metabolic syndrome without being diabetics, and that's why it's an important distinction, I think. But also, diabetes not only affects the heart, it affects every blood vessel in the body. So it's what we call macrovascular disease, which is stroke, heart attack, blockages in your legs. But it's also microvascular disease, where it affects the eyes, the kidneys, the peripheral nerves. So there's a whole lot of things that it does.
And it's the leading cause of death, disability, and reduced quality of life across the globe.
Yeah, absolutely.
It creates a huge impact. All right, I really like to take a closer look at the risk factors for type 2 diabetes. So what are some of the things that we can't change, those non-modifiable risk factors?
Well, as I said, you can't change your race. So if you're white, if you're Asian, if you've got darker skin, that will obviously affect. So the genetics that you're born into, and also obviously if you've got a really strong family history of type 2 diabetes within one of those racial groups, then you'll have more chance of getting diabetes. So it's a combination of the genetics and the ethnic groups, but also age as well. And see, here's the problem, and I say this all the time. We were only designed to work well for 30, 40 years wandering around a jungle with a spear. We weren't designed to live AA use by date in a completely artificial world that we live in. So when you hit 50 and the hormones go south, all of these degenerative problems, including insulin resistance, which is the gene, but all of the problems that become manifest of that become more common because the body is wearing out, the pancreas is wearing out, the blood vessels are getting stiffer, the heart's getting stiffer. So all of these things get worse as you get older.
Right. Oh, goodness. Okay. So genetics, ethnicity, and age, all things we can't control and all things that impact our risk of diabetes. What about the things we can control? So what are our, key modifiable risk factors that contribute to diabetes?
Yeah. Well, I've already explained insulin resistance. So I'll move on to just the big thing, diabesity. Now, I wish I could say it was my term. It wasn't. I stole it from someone else. But it's
I claimed it for you. You could have just gone with it.
Oh, yeah, but we've got the truth in all things. So what it is clearly is obviously the combination of type 2 diabetes and obesity. And that's just through people getting too much body weight. And the body weight, of course, that's the problem, is the weight around the tummy. So I say there's two sites that you really want to try and avoid putting on weight. One is around the abdomen and one is around the throat. The reason around the throat because of sleep apnea, or around the abdomen because of it's not just an ugly lump of lard, it's a toxic reservoir that's holding onto all the chemicals you've been exposed to over the years. And also it's an inflammatory organ, so it's inflaming things. And also it's a manifestation of visceral fat. So what you see in front of your tummy is also in your heart, in your liver, in your lungs, in the brain, in the kidneys. This is probably an indelicate thing to say. I'm not known for saying indelicate things, but
Oh,
I'll
goodness, I'm
just
scared already.
no. But if you do an autopsy on someone who dies with significant obesity, half of their heart is full of fat. Now, I'm saying that
Oh,
to shock
wow.
people because I want people to realize the pervasive effects of carrying too much weight. And so that's really the major risk factor, modifiable risk factor for insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes. And going with that is a lousy diet. So people who have a lot of refined carbohydrates. So I'm not talking about good quality carbohydrates. The best carbohydrates on the planet are a thing called fruit and vegetables, and legumes. But the refined carbohydrates, such as any form of sugar, white bread, pasta, potatoes, rice. I'm not saying people shouldn't eat this stuff. I'm just saying they shouldn't have it as the center of their plate. Obviously, the fruits and vegetables should be. Unhealthy fats, especially the trans fats, all contribute to the insulin resistance converting into prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and anything in a box or a container with a use-by date can cause issues as well. And then we've already mentioned gestational diabetes. Other health conditions are just associated with insulin resistance, like polycystic ovaries, high blood pressure. I've already mentioned the metabolic syndrome. So all of these things are there and a part of all of this.
And of course, what we know with weight, like you were mentioning weight and fat mass before, is you can't spot check where your weight is. You just know that if you're carrying excess weight, there's a risk that that's going to be in your heart and around your visceral organs. So I think when you mentioned around your neck and your belly, if that's just your body type, that you tend to hold fat around those areas, then you're just at a greater risk, but you can't be like, no, I want to get fatter on my arms instead.
No,
It just is
No,
how your body
it's
is.
just wherever you're going to get that weight. But I'm not a great believer in things like BMI. I much prefer waist circumference.
No.
I think waist circumference is a much better indication. So, for example, if you do BMIs on first grade football players who are incredibly muscular, they're in the obese range because they've got so much musculature. So somebody who is really, really skinny with not a lot of muscles might have a low BMI, but still have a significant amount of abdominal fat. So get out the tape measure around the waist is my message.
Okay. Now, what are some of the symptoms that we can look out for? So for example, I get a full blood test once a year. But say someone isn't doing that, like what can they potentially notice or look out for and think, oh, I probably should get a blood test?
Well, the classic signs of any form of diabetes is being intensely thirsty and passing a lot of urine. But another big one, and this is a non-specific sign or symptom for most diseases that are significant and need to be managed, unbelievable tiredness. So, for example, doesn't have a lot to do with type 2 diabetes, but if people are about to have a heart attack in the next day or two, they just get exhausted. They feel, for some reason, I'm just so tired. So if that's happening to you and you're also passing a lot of urine, feeling hungry, that can be a significant manifestation of diabetes of any sort. People that are very prone to skin infections, itchy skin infections, maybe blurred vision's another one because the sugar builds up in the lens of the eye swells, you don't see as well. Weight gain, weight loss can be a manifestation either way, and headaches, mood swings, just sort of weird symptoms. So they're the sort of things you look out for. But the point is, don't get to that stage. Go and have a preventative checkup, for goodness sake.
Yeah. Do you know if I eat too much sugar in one sitting, my eyes burn? This is what you're saying. Like, obviously, it impacts your eyes.
Yeah, I don't think people realise the pervasive effects of modern diets and modern lack of activity, and a lot of the symptoms people get where there's nothing, they don't have a particular disease, they just don't feel well. Often it's because of what they're abusing. Like last week on my radio show, I spoke about a trial out of the New England Journal of Medicine, my favourite journal, where of 257 people with who undergone a carotid endarterectomy, where they remount the carotid arteries in the neck. And they looked at the specimens and examined them for microplastics and nanoplastics. And they found that the people who had the most amount of microplastics in the specimen itself, So you ingest plastics by either drinking out of plastic bottles or reheating food in a plastic container, or just being exposed to a lot of plastics. Go to your fridge and see what's not in plastic, for goodness sake. And so
Wow.
people who are exposed to that, the plastics get into the system, get absorbed into the blood vessels and get stuck in the walls of blood vessels. So this showed those yeah, that's true. It's called micro nanoplastics. And those who had the highest amount of these MNPs in their blood vessels over the next 3 years after the operation had 4.5 times the amount of stroke, heart attack, and sudden death compared with people who didn't have a lot of microplastics there. So just
My Lord, that's blown my mind.
But this is the modern world. This is what we're doing. Yeah. We think, oh, look, I'll eat good food. But what is the good food being packaged in? Just as one example. I mean, I know I'm getting off the topic, but I just think it's important information.
Wow. And I think we're doing a lot better than a lot of other countries where you actually get served hot food in a plastic bag rather than on a glass plate or a container. Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay, so say that you're somebody, you've noticed you've got a bunch of these symptoms. How do you actually go about getting diagnosed? What do you do?
Yeah, well, I mentioned before the levels that you need to be tested. So we've sort of gone over that. But just as I said, I don't believe in the glucose tolerance test. A lot of doctors do. And if you want to do it, that's fine. But I personally think it's 2 hours of your life you never get back. So just don't do it. But just get that overnight fast, as I said, and a specific diagnosis of diabetes, just to repeat it because it's important, is a fasting blood sugar level above 7.5 and a hemoglobin A1C above 6.5. So just one test and it gives you those readings.
Okay. Whew. We have covered so much today. I'm so glad we made the decision to split this episode into 2 parts.
It's a lot of information.
So much information. I mean, when you say diabetes, you just think it's just this one thing, but there's so much to
Very
it.
Complex.
And I'm really looking forward to next week where we get to talk about, like how to actually manage diabetes, what happens if we don't manage diabetes, and how we can also prevent or even reverse having type 2 diabetes altogether. Wow, so good. All right, let's finish up with the member question of the week, Ross.
Yeah, and the member question of the week is for you, Dr. Gina, not for me. So I saw that. I saw that you recently released a book, and I think this is a book that should be on everyone's bookshelf. It's The Habit Revolution, and the person there it is. Yes, I love a shameless plug. Nothing like a shameless plug. The Habit Revolution.
You set me up for this one.
That's very good. Which I'm currently reading, says the member. If there were 3 major takeaways, not in plastic containers, of course. No, sorry. If there were 3 major takeaways from the book for a person wanting to change their habits, what would they be?
Oh my gosh, so many come to mind. Okay. Firstly, you are not stuck with your brain. You can, at any moment in time, change your habits, reshape your life, redesign things. You can create new habits and break old habits at any point in time. An old dog can learn new tricks. The other point that I would make is that small steps actually equate to big life changes compared to trying to change big things. So we want to actually focus more on consistency than intensity. Your brain just needs to learn to start something and the rest takes care of itself. So you're not stuck with your brain. Take small, consistent steps. And it does not take 21 days to change a habit. It takes anywhere between sort of 10 weeks to up to 7 months to change a habit. That's what I would say to those.
That sounds like fantastic information.
Thanks, Ross. Well, that brings us to the end of this week's episode on Eat, Live and Move with Miyagi. Whatever platform you're listening to today, please hit subscribe. And we are so excited for you to join us next week on part 2 of this diabetes series. See you.
Bye.